It's a pleasure and privilege to be back at the BDB Book Club. I still recall 3 years back I had come to Pune to deliver a session on my book, The Curious Marketer. And I remember what an energizing session that was. Uh, of course, I think today digital is the way to go, given the pandemic. And I'm really looking forward to narrating to you the story of my new book, Tata Stories. If you don't mind, just give me a minute to put a presentation on the screen, and then Mr. Balani, I will check with you whether the presentation is showing well. Uh, uh, can you see the
Yes.
presentation, Mr. Balani? And
Yes,
is
we
it
can.
full screen?
Yes, it is full screen. We are able to see.
So, my latest book is Tata Stories, and it has 40 timeless tales from the history of the Tata Group. I wrote this book during the first 10 months of the pandemic last year. And the reason I did it was very simple. The first few months of the pandemic were particularly depressing. There were lockdowns. We were unable to go out of home too much. Offices were closed. I was working out of home. I had some extra time with me because there was no travel time. And I said, in this milieu where people are feeling despondent, some people had lost jobs, some people had lost incomes. I said, let me write stories which are inspiring and which can elevate the human mind. And since I've worked with the Tata Group for 34 years, I said, what better than to pick out some stories from the Tata Group? I began writing them and posting them on LinkedIn, where they got a huge audience. And in fact, as Mr. Money was saying, Mr. Money wrote back to me after reading a few of those stories to say, why don't you compile them into a book? And that's the story of how this book was born. I believe these are astonishing and remarkable stories. They may be from the history of the Tata Group, but they're actually stories that belong to each of us in India. I want to start this session of storytelling by asking all of you to sit back, enjoy the session, have a cup of tea or coffee, because this is a session of storytelling. There are no concepts here, there are only stories, but they're amazing stories. Let me start with the first story for today. And right in front of you, you see a building. Please feel free on the chat window if you want to really, tell us where you think this building is. Uh, Some people say Bombay, some people say Ahmedabad, some people say Delhi. But this building that you see here is from the small town of Navsari in Gujarat. And this is the building where Jamshedji Tata was born. This is his birthplace, the founder of the Tata Group. He was born here on the 3rd of March, 1839. And at the age of 13, his father, the Survanji Tata, relocated to Mumbai. They came from a family of Parsi priests, but his dad decided to go into the merchant business. He was a trader and a merchant. They relocated to Mumbai. The young Jamshedji Tata was very fond of reading, like I'm sure all of you are. He was particularly enamored of Charles Dickens, of William Makepeace Thackeray, of Mark Twain. He used to read their books extensively. He joined his father in his father's merchant and trading business. Spent some time in Shanghai, spent some time in London, but then in 1868, he began his own firm. That firm was the start of the Tata Group as you know it today, 1868, which means the Tata Group is 153 years of age today. In 1874, 6 years after he founded the firm, he founded the very first Tata Group company. Today, you know of so many Tata Group companies, but what you see here is the very first industrial enterprise of the Tata Group. It was called the Empress Mills at Nagpur. This was a textile weaving mill, and it was located in Nagpur because Nagpur is close to the cotton belt of India. And the picture you see here shows you the women who are at the weaving looms. Soon it became a very, very profitable enterprise. In fact, it became one of the most profitable companies in India at that time. And how did it achieve that level of profit? By a couple of things. One is that Jamshedji Tata used the best quality of cotton in these mills. He ensured that he used only long stapled cotton, and he ensured that the quality of that cotton that he was supplying to his customers was excellent, and the customers came back for more. The second is he used manufacturing innovations. The ring spindle, you see right on top of here, the rings that you see, the ring spindle. He started using the ring spindle in the Empress mills well before even developed countries like the United Kingdom were using the ring spindle. So he believed in technological innovation as a means of improving productivity. And so this mill became very prosperous. In fact, it paid back its shareholders 20 times their share capital very quickly thereafter. But that's not the reason I'm narrating this story to you today. The reason I'm narrating this story to you is something very different. Look at the women in this photograph. The women in this photograph, you will note, are semi-educated or probably even uneducated. They came from towns in and around Nagpur, joined the Empress Mills, and began working there. Jamshedji Tata, in his mind, said that doing something for these employees in the community was as important as making profits. So, at a time when the HRD department did not exist, when human resources development was not yet a concept that was spoken about, in 1887, he introduced a pension fund for these women. For the first time in India, there was a pension fund for employees. In 1895, he established an accident compensation scheme for these workers. And do you know what he did in 1901? A concept which is very familiar to us today when we look at our pay slips is the Provident Fund. In 1901, for the very first time ever in India, a Provident Fund was introduced at the Empress Mills. These were pioneering innovations well ahead of their time on worker welfare. The next photograph I'm going to show you is even more amazing. More than 100 years ago, Empress Mills had a creche for the babies of the women who were working in the mill. You have seen the women working in the mill, and for their babies, there was a creche created at Empress Mills. I'm amazed when I look at this photograph because even today, after 100 years have passed, many industries in India don't have creches for working women's children. But more than 100 years ago, Jamshedji Tata did this. Look at that small girl on one side raising her hands in salute. Look at those babies being tended by the nurses whom you can also see here. And it is amazing to imagine that this happened 100 years back, more than 100 years back. But all this costs money to do. So many people ask Jamshedji Tata, why are you investing so much money in all these measures? Your mill is very profitable, it's doing very well. What is the reason for this? In 1895, and this is the picture of Jamshedji Tata, the founder of the Tata Group. In 1895, he made a speech where he addressed this issue. Look at what he said, and I've got, I got from our archives a typed copy of that speech. It's fascinating to read it. Look at what he says here. He says, we do not claim to be more unselfish, more generous, or more philanthropic than other people. But we think we started on sound and straightforward business principles. Considering the interests of our shareholders our own, and the health and welfare of our employees, the sure foundation of our prosperity. It was a philosophy which was developing in his mind that our duty to shareholders is paramount. Our companies have to be profitable. Our companies have to be competitive. Otherwise, how do you deliver, value to your shareholders? But at the same time, the health and welfare of our employees and the community is the sure foundation of our prosperity. So 130 years back, he was developing the concept of stakeholder capitalism, where he was saying that companies don't exist only for their shareholders. They also exist for their employees and the community. And soon in his mind, employees became community, community became the nation. And he developed a philosophy where he said the community should be center stage in the business that I am setting up. That is how the philosophy and the why of the Tata Group developed, ladies and gentlemen. And that is why when he created Tata Steel, he created because he thought India needed steel. For its development in the future, India could not import all its steel because bridges and roads and dams had to be built in India. That is why when he created Tata Steel, he also created the town of Jamshedpur, uh, spent investing a lot of money in it. And that has remained the philosophy of the Tata Group ever since then, whether it is Tata Airlines, whether it is TCS, whether it's Tata Salt, they've all been created with an approach of nation building. So I wanted to narrate this first story to you because the first story actually puts forward why we exist. Why does the Tata Group exist? But let me move on to another story now. And the story I'm going to move on is a dramatic story, and one which is also, one which was again very remarkable because it brought two of the finest minds in India together in a very unusual way. The ship that you see behind you, look at the ship behind you. This ship behind you is a very special ship. It was called the SS Empress of India. It was a ship with graceful ship painted white. It had two buff-colored funnels banded with black paint on the top. You can see them, the black painted funnels. It was sporting three tall masts. You can see the three tall masts on the ship. It could accommodate 770 passengers. And on the 14th of July, 1893, this ship set sail from Yokohama in Japan to Vancouver in Canada. On this ship were two passengers, both of whom would contribute significantly to India's development. One passenger was the gentleman you see here, Jamshedji Tata. He had gone to Japan to look at collaboration with Japanese companies on silk manufacturing, on starting a shipping line, and he was now on his way from Japan to Chicago, where the World Exposition was going on. The World Exposition was actually there to mark 400 years of Christopher Columbus's arrival in America. The other passenger on the ship, whom we will talk about, was a young monk. He had gone to Japan as well, and he was on his way to Chicago to address the World Parliament of Religions, which was also being held in 1893. At that time, he was relatively unknown, but later India would know him as Swami Vivekananda. Now, Jamshedji Tata and Swami Vivekananda, the young monk, met on that ship. This ship took 12 days to go from from Yokohama to Vancouver. They discussed many things on the ship. Actually, there is no recording of what they discussed, but there are research papers which have been written about it, and Swami Vivekananda's disciple, Sister Nivedita, has also commented on it. They discussed many issues to do with nation building. It's said that Swami Vivekananda encouraged Jamshedji Tata not to import matchboxes, but to manufacture them in our own country and make sure that it provided employment. Jamshedji Tata must have discussed with Swami Vivekananda the need for science and technology education in India, because Swami Vivekananda himself said the order of monks has to become technologically educated and contribute to India's technological development. I'm sure, I would have loved to be a passenger on this ship overhearing the conversation of these two giant people. They discussed many of these themes. There are a couple of research papers which speculate what the discussions could have been. And 12 days later, the ship reached Vancouver. Both of them disembarked from the ship, went to Chicago, where Jamshedji Tata attended the World Exposition. And Swami Vivekananda, of course, gave that rousing address at the Parliament of Religions. I hope you remember what he said. He stood up and said, "Sisters and brothers of America." And the whole hall broke into applause, standing applause for 5 minutes, as he put forward the key tenets of Hinduism at the Parliament of Religions. Now that voyage was over, and both of them came back to India. In the meanwhile, Jamshedji Tata was thinking about India's future, and he came to the conclusion that something that was essential for India's future was technology and technological education of Indians. He had actually started a scholarship in 1892 for Indians going abroad for studies, the J. Tata Endowment Scholarship. But that could, by its very nature, only fund a limited number of people because education abroad was, as continues to be, very expensive. So he said, we should have a University of Science, Research and Education, higher education in India. And it became a dream and a passion. At one stage, he committed to that dream and passion half his wealth. He committed half his wealth and said this wealth will go completely towards the establishment of this university. He committed an endowment of 30 lakhs in the year 1898. 30 lakhs at that time was a fabulous sum of money. And he said, this endowment will be used completely to set up the Research University of Science. But he ran into roadblocks. The British were ruling India at that time. Lord Curzon asked him several questions. Will you get enough professors? Will there be enough students? Is there a demand for this kind of university in India? Would Indians get the opportunity they deserved here? And various other misgivings were expressed. Jamshedji Tata was a man of great determination. What could he do? He could not let his dream lapse of a science university. So he wrote a letter. And he wrote this letter to Swami Vivekananda. In this letter, look at what he says in this letter. And this is a rare copy of that letter that I have got from our archives. He says, I trust you remember me as a fellow traveler on your voyage from Japan to Chicago. I very much recall at this moment your views, which you expressed on the ship, on the growth of the ascetic spirit in India and the duty not of creating but diverting it into useful channels. And then he goes to talk about my eye scheme of a research institute of science for India, of which you have doubtless heard or read. And he goes on in this letter to request Swami Vivekananda for his help. He says that this is essential for our country. And he says, if a crusade in favor of this kind of an institution were undertaken by you, by a competent leader like you, it will help asceticism, science, and the good name of our country. And I would not know for a more fitting general of such a campaign than Vivekananda. And he ends the letter by saying, do you think you would care to apply yourself to the mission of galvanizing into life our ancient traditions in this respect? Perhaps you had better begin with a fiery pamphlet rousing our people in this matter. I should cheerfully defray all the expenses of publication. So this is Jamshedji Tata writing to Swami Vivekananda because he thought that he required support not only from the ruling government, but he also reached out to one of the most influential spiritual leaders of India, seeking his support for the establishment of the University of Science. What did Swami Vivekananda do? Swami Vivekananda, in 1899, this is the issue of 1899 April of Prabuddha Bharata, which was the monthly journal of the Ramakrishna order, which Swami Vivekananda himself had started. He issued a rousing support for Mr. Tata's scheme. And in response to Mr. Tata's letter, look at what he says. We are not aware if any project at once so opportune and so far-reaching in its beneficial effects was ever mooted in India as that of the Postgraduate Research Institute of Mr. Tata. The scheme grasps the vital point of weakness in our national well-being, which is that we need science education in India. It paves the path for placing into the hands of Indians this knowledge for the future. Now, this project was slated to cost 74 lakhs, and Jamshedji Tata had given away half his wealth, which was 30 lakhs, but we needed to raise more funds. So here is what Swami Vivekananda says. By some, the scheme is regarded as chimerical because of the immense amount of money required for it, about 74 lakhs. The best answer to this fear is, if one man could find 30 lakhs, could not the whole of the country find the rest? It is ridiculous to think otherwise. And he goes on to say, we repeat, no idea more potent for the good of the whole nation has seen the light of day in modern India. Let the whole nation, therefore, forgetful of class or sect interests, join in making it a success. This rousing appeal worked with Indians. It worked with some of the Maharajas as well as the common people. And the Maharaja of Mysore, represented by his Diwan Seshadri Iyer, the Maharaja decided to gift land for the establishment of the University of Science, Postgraduate University of Science at Bangalore. There were some other donations which also came about. Eventually, the British supported the cause when they found that this was a cause which was getting more and more popular support. And that, ladies and gentlemen, led to the foundation of the Indian Institute of Science at Bangalore. This is the backstory of how the Indian Institute of Science was founded. It continues to remain the top-ranked science university in the country today, always features amongst the top 100 in the world. Unfortunately, neither Jamshedji Tata nor Swami Vivekananda were alive when this institute was born in 1911. It took a few years to establish it. Many Nobel laureates have come out of this institute or have worked there, including Dr. C.V. Raman. Sadly, neither of them saw the birth of this institute. But I can assure you, and I think that their blessings and their presence permeate every corridor, every lecture hall, and every laboratory of this famous institution. To me, when I researched this story and wrote it, what came to life was that both these people, Swami Vivekananda and Jamshedji Tata, they lived, they toiled and died for the love of their nation. And there is nothing more powerful that can actually inspire us to do things with our own life. But let me quickly move to another story, ladies and gentlemen. I'm now moving all the way from Jamshedji Tata in the year 1893, 1898 to virtually a century after that, 1995, 1998. By now, Mr. Ratan Tata was the chairman of the Tata Group. And once in 1995, standing up in the Automobile Manufacturers Association of India, Mr. Tata said, why can't India have its own car? And the reason he said this was very clear. When you build your own car in India, you create employment. You also put in place standards of engineering excellence, which are unheard of because the car industry leads to a lot of engineering ancillaries coming up. At that time, India had just two cars. The Ambassador and the Fiat were already gone. We had the Maruti Suzuki, which was designed in Japan and assembled in Gurgaon. And we had the Hyundai car, which was designed in Korea and assembled in Sri Perumbudur near Chennai. But we did not have a car which was designed, developed in India with all the ancillary parts being made in India. So when Ratan Tata stood up and said this, people were skeptical. They said, can India make its own car? We don't have the technology to do it. Despite the fact that by then, India had launched its own satellite, Aryabhata. India had actually exploded its first nuclear device at Pokhran many years ago. But still, there was no confidence that we could make our own car. So Mr. Ratan Tata said, if the industry is not willing to join together, we at Telco or Tata Motors are going to do this. And he had a visionary call. He said, I need the car the size of an Ambassador because Indian families tend to travel large, the fuel efficiency of a Maruti Suzuki because we are very value conscious, and the styling of a Zen. And these are some first designs which were created. He got the engineers of Telco, as it was then called, Tata Motors, the Engineering Research Center, to work on designing this car along with the idea of Turin in Italy. Ancillary parts for the car were also designed in and around India. And that's how the Tata Indica first took birth. But it was not an easy voyage. A car manufacturing plant would cost several $billions. So Mr. Ratan Tata and his leadership team went round the world scouring for a car manufacturing plant which was affordable. They found a disused Nissan plant in Australia. Brick by brick, that plant was disassembled in Australia and moved all the way to a city which many of you know very well, your home city of Pune. And that is how the Tata Motors car plant in Pimpri Chinchwad area of Pune was born. There was already a truck plant there, but the car plant was born. And that is where the Tata Indica was assembled. Mr. Tata took an active interest in the manufacture of the car, visiting the shop floor often. Once when he saw workers bending 300 times a day to put some part in place, he asked for that process to get automated. Workers still remember this very fondly till today. I have gone to the Tata Motors plant in Pune and met some of these workers. They have spoken to me in the Marathi language. They are school educated people from interior parts of Maharashtra. They told me that when the first Indica was assembled, it took them 8 days to assemble the first Indica. Today, you go to the Tata Motors plant in Pune, a car comes out every 56 seconds. And this is how the Tata Indica was born. The first ever car entirely designed and manufactured for Indians by an Indian company. This is the first Indica coming out of Tata Motors Pune, driven by none other than Mr. Ratan Tata himself. The car received more than 1 lakh bookings when it was launched. People went wow about the shape of the car, the design of the car. But immediately after launch, it ran into some quality issues. Even today, people at Tata Motors squirm when they think about those issues. There was noise, the suspensions were not working well, the finish of the car was not good, but that did not deter Mr. Ratan Tata. Just like what the British said did not deter Jamshedji Tata. He said, we will fix these. They met customers, they met distributors, they had task forces formed to fix the quality issues, and within a year's time they launched Indica V2, a car which was splendid and which went on to become the fastest selling car on the face of India for the next 2 years thereafter. In fact, it was described as the best car in India those days. Today, of course, you see the Tata Harrier, you see the Tata Nexon, you see electric vehicles coming out from the Tata stable. But this was the genesis of how India's first own car was built and the dream which went into it. Many people have asked Mr. Ratan Tata, what gave you the trust and confidence to do this? And his answer has always been, I had trust in Tata Motors engineers and I wanted to do this for the young people of India. He has gone on record to say, history may say we succeeded or history may say we failed, but we knew, we thought of it and we did it. We produced India's first car. So, I moved from India's first Provident Fund to India's first science university to India's first car. But I must now go to a very, very different story, ladies and gentlemen, very different story from the Tata Group. Nothing to do with industry, nothing to do with education, but everything to do with sports. The person, and I've narrated the story in my book, but I want to briefly narrate it to you now. The gentleman you see in this photograph, I mean, if any of you want to put down his name on the chat box, please feel free to do so. He is Sir Dorabji Tata, the second chairman of the Tata Group and the elder son of Jamshedji Tata. Now, and this story once again has a very close link to your hometown of Pune. In the year 1919, Sir Dorabji Tata was at the Deccan Gymkhana in Pune, giving away the prizes at the annual sports meet of the Deccan Gymkhana. And when he was there, he saw some peasants, farmers, running races, and he saw them run very, very quickly, though they were running with bare feet. And as he looked at them, he said, my God, these people are running with equal speed as European athletes. Why in that case is our country, India, not at the greatest sporting event on earth, Olympics? Until then, India had never sent a team to the Olympics. But Dorabji Tata was a man who was very proud of his country, and he said, we are a proud country. How come India is not represented in the Olympics? So when he came back from Deccan Gymkhana in Pune, he spoke to the governor of Bombay, requested the governor to put him in touch with the International Olympic Committee, and got India accredited with the International Olympic Committee. India did not even have an Olympic committee of its own at that time. So he actually put a selection committee together himself to select athletes going for the 1920 Antwerp Olympics. Eventually, 6 athletes were selected for the 1920 Antwerp Olympics by the selection committee that was put together by Sir Dorabji Tata. There were 2 wrestlers and there were 4 runners. P.F. Chaugale from Hubli and A. Datar from Satara ran the marathon. K. Kaikadi from Belgaum, G. Navale from Mumbai, and N. Shinde from Kolhapur participated in wrestling. And Purma Banerjee from Bengal ran the 400-meter race, and he was the proud flag bearer for the Indian team. But this required money to send them to Antwerp. So Dorabji Tata also decided to fund this effort, and he put a lot of his personal funds into sponsoring this team. This proposal fired the ambition of the national element in the city of Pune, and this was the first team that India sent to the Olympics, Antwerp of 1920, exactly 100 years ago, driven by this man's pride that we should be present at the greatest sporting event on earth. That first team did not win a medal at the Olympics, but they came back very proud. It was a moment of pride when Purma Banerjee held the Indian flag. At that time, it was the British Indian flag, and went into the Antwerp stadium. But when Dorabji Tata returned from Antwerp, he called the director of YMCA in Mumbai, Dr. Noren, and told him, go across the country. Let's evangelize sports. Sports is good for our people, good for health, good for fitness. And Dr. Noren did that. In 1924, 4 years later, so Dorabji Tata again led the process of sending the second Indian team to the Olympics. This was the Paris Olympics in 1924. Now he also got a lot of contributions from Indian states, from Indian Maharajas, and put a larger team together for the Paris Olympics of 1924. Again, India did not win a medal in that Olympics. In 1927, the Indian Olympic Committee was formed with Sir Dorabji Tata as its founder president. If you go to the Indian Olympic Committee website even today, you will see Sir Dorabji Tata's name proudly featured there as the founder president of the Indian Olympic Committee. And in 1928, we sent a 21-member contingent to the Amsterdam Olympics of 1928. This time there was also a hockey team selected by the Indian Hockey Federation. In that Olympics, ladies and gentlemen, the Indian hockey team did not lose a single match. They entered the quarterfinals, they entered the semifinals, they entered the finals, and in the finals, in front of the home crowd at Amsterdam, they beat Netherlands 3-0 to win India's first ever gold medal at the Olympics. That is how India's entry into the Olympics began. And that is how India's medal winning performance in the Olympics began. We were so proud a few months ago, 2 months ago, when Indian athletes won their best ever record haul in the Tokyo Olympics. But sit back for a moment and listen to this. This is the history of India's participation in the Olympics. Once again, just like Jamshedji Tata and Indian Institute of Science, or just like Mr. Ratan Tata and the Tata Indica, this dream also of sending India to the Olympics was born out of pride in the nation. I sometimes ask myself, why would an industrialist, the chairman of the Tata Group, look at the nation's entry into the Olympics? And this can only be driven by pride in the nation. So Dorabji Tata himself was an avid sportsman. He was very passionate about sport, and his purpose was to contribute to the country. And when your passion and purpose come together so closely, I think it can actually work magic. Many people don't know of this story. And therefore, in this book, Tata Stories, I have narrated the story in great detail of what happened and how Sir Dorabji Tata sponsored and actually led India's entry into the Olympics. India has thereafter participated in every single Summer Olympics without fail. But since I'm talking about Sir Dorabji Tata, let me move to a very different story about Sir Dorabji Tata. And this is a very interesting story. It has nothing to do with the Olympics. It has nothing really to do with starting up an industry. But this story has something to do personally with the kind of person that Sir Dorabji Tata was and the kind of a lady that his wife was, Lady Meherbai Tata. In 1898, Sir Dorabji Tata got married to Mehri, the lady you see on the right, who was also later called Meherbai Tata, and later she was also knighted and known as Lady Meherbai Tata. Actually, they got married on Valentine's Day in 1898. And Sir Dorabji Tata was deeply in love with his wife. She was a very independent woman. She was one of the first feminist icons of India, but that's a different story, which I've also narrated. But in truth, in the year 1900, Sir Dorabji Tata bought a very, very special gift for his wife. This was a diamond. This diamond that he bought for his wife, and you can see it here, she's wearing this diamond. So take a close look at this diamond. This diamond weighed 245.35 carats. It was the sixth largest diamond in the world, mined at the Jagersfontein mine in South Africa. At 245 carats, ladies and gentlemen, this diamond was twice as large as the legendary Kohinoor diamond. Exceptional purity and sparkle. And he gifted this diamond to his wife, Meherbai. She used to wear this diamond on special occasions in her life, actually with a platinum chain. It was on a platinum chain and a claw, and you can see her wearing this diamond just now on the screen. It said this diamond was so valuable that each time they took it out of the locker, they had to pay the insurance company money. Now, what happened in the 1990s and thereafter, of course, in the 1940s and 1990s, this First World War happened. Dorabji Tata was the head of the Tata Group, which had Tata Steel and Tata Power and a couple of other companies at that time. But because of the First World War, the demand for steel collapsed after the war. Japan went into a recession, the demand for steel collapsed in Japan, and this led to serious problems for Tata Steel, which was still in its first 10 years of its infancy. The problems were so serious that one day in 1924, Sir Dorabji Tata got a telegram from Jamshedpur saying we are close to collapse. We don't even have money to pay our workers their next salary. This is Tata Steel, okay, the flagship company of the Tata Group, sending a telegram to the chairman saying we don't even have money to pay salaries the next time to our workers. What did Sir Dorabji Tata do? Tata Steel was owned by many shareholders. The Tatas only had a small, part of that equity. It was listed, and many shareholders had invested in Tata Steel. Without blinking an eyelid, Lady Meherbai Tata and Sir Dorabji Tata decided to pledge their entire wealth to the Imperial Bank of India, which is the today's State Bank, to raise a loan for Tata Steel. Their entire wealth at that time was about 1 crore of rupees, which in today's money terms would be so many multiples of that, maybe running into hundreds of crores. He pledged that entire wealth to the Imperial Bank of India, including the Jubilee Diamond, the diamond that he had bought for Lady Meherbai Tata. So the Jubilee Diamond and the rest of his wealth got pledged to the Imperial Bank of India. They raised a loan of 1 crore. It was used to pay workers their salary. Not a single worker was retrenched. And then, of course, the rest of the money was used to finance Tata Steel, and Tata Steel went on to become a very profitable enterprise after that. But it was saved from collapse by this pledging of the diamond and pledging of all their wealth to raise money for Tata Steel. It was extraordinary that you are putting your personal wealth to save a company from ruin and collapse. A few years later, Lady Meherbai Tata passed away in 1931, and in 1932, Sir Dorabji Tata also passed away. And in his will, he left all his money, all his funds to the Sir Dorabji Tata Trust, including the Jubilee Diamond. The Jubilee Diamond was actually sold through Cartier to raise money, and the money that was raised by the sale of the Jubilee Diamond eventually went into the creation of a very famous institution that you have heard of, the Tata Memorial Hospital in Mumbai, which was Asia's first cancer hospital and India's first cancer hospital as well. So as I look back at this story, ladies and gentlemen, it is a story of a diamond. It is a story of saving a steel company. It is a story of hearts of gold of both these people. But most, and it symbolizes the relationship that the Tata Group has with its companies. And very importantly, I tell myself that this must be the most fortunate diamond in the world. In one case, it saved so many jobs and it saved a company. And then it went on to create a cancer hospital, which today provides treatment to 70,000 people a year. 70% of those people are treated free of charge. And of course, every family knows someone or the other who has been treated at the Tata Memorial Hospital. So that is the story that I wanted to narrate for you. Very, very different from the earlier stories that I've narrated. I've taken time now to narrate 4 or 5 stories to you. Let me end with one more story. I can just keep going on and on, but let me end with one more story. And this is a story from the life of one more gentleman who needs no introduction, but I'd like to talk to you about him, who is J.R.D. Tata. J.R.D. Tata was chairman of the Tata Group for more than 50 years. Very keen aviator. But this story actually goes back to his youth. When he was 29 years of age, J.R.D. Tata saw in the Times of London an announcement by the Aga Khan. The Aga Khan said that he would give a prize, and I think the prize was about 500 pounds. At that time, a large amount of money. He would give a prize for the person who could solo fly the fastest from India to England or England to India. You could go either way. It announced a prize of 500 UK pounds for the first flight and the fastest flight by a person of Indian nationality. It must be a solo flight completed within 6 weeks from the date of starting. J.R.D. Tata had already got his pilot's license by then. In fact, his pilot license bore the number 1. So J.R.D. decided, young man, he decided to participate in this race. 2 others also participated in this race. There was a young person called Manmohan Singh, and there was a young Parsi person, 18 years of age or 19 years of age, called Aspi Engineer. And then, ladies and gentlemen, this race began. Manmohan Singh and Aspi Engineer decided to fly from England to India. JRD Tata decided to fly from India to England. And of course, their flights would be timed, and whoever was the fastest would get the prize. So JRD Tata started flying out of Karachi on his way to London, and Aspi Engineer and Manmohan Singh started flying out of London on their way to Karachi. Manmohan Singh's flight got lost twice or thrice, and he got very delayed, and therefore he could not win the race because he exceeded the time duration given. But Aspi Engineer was a very, very good pilot, and Aspi Engineer piloted his aircraft expertly. However, on the route from England to India, Aspi Engineer's aircraft developed faulty spark plugs. The spark plugs started malfunctioning. And so Aspi Engineer, with his Gypsy Moth biplane, he landed at the Abu Qir airstrip near Alexandria in Egypt and started a search for new spark plugs for his aircraft. That was not very easy. In those days, you could not get spark plugs for your aircraft just like that. So he had to wait perhaps for several days. In the meanwhile, JRD Tata had started off from Karachi. He had flown towards Jask in Iran, then towards Basra in Iraq, and from Iraq he flew towards Baghdad and then towards Cairo. They didn't permit him to land in Cairo. He actually lost his way a little bit and landed in an old World War I airstrip at Haifa. But Cairo directed him to the Abu Qir airstrip. When he landed at the Abu Qir airstrip, he found the other aircraft there. And he wondered whose aircraft it was. And he soon found that this was the aircraft of his competitor, Aspi Engineer. So he met Aspi Engineer and asked him, Aspi, why are you here? Well, what are you doing here? You should be flying the race now. At 7 a.m. in the morning when he landed there. So Aspi Engineer told him, listen, my spark plugs are faulty. Something's gone wrong with them. And I'm waiting for replacement spark plugs to be obtained. It may take me a couple of days to do that. JRD Tata immediately said, listen, but I have 4 spare spark plugs. I have actually 8 spark plugs, so 4 of them are spare. Let me give you my spare spark plugs so that you don't waste time. And he gave Aspi Engineer those 4 spare spark plugs. Aspi Engineer put them into his aircraft. The aircraft started functioning fine again. I am told he gifted JRD Tata with a Mae West jacket, and Aspi Engineer started flying the race once again. And JRD Tata also took off from Abu Qir on his way to England. JRD Tata landed next close to Libya. He landed in an Air Force base which would not permit the flyers to leave early in the morning, so he wasted some time there. In the meanwhile, Aspi Engineer flew very well after the replacement of the spark plugs and reached Karachi. By the time Aspi Engineer could reach Karachi, JRD Tata could reach only Paris. He was still 2 to 3 hours away from England, and so he lost the race. He lost that race to Aspi Engineer. But like they say in India, ladies and gentlemen, kahani apni baki hai. Many years later, many years later, in the 1950s, JRD Tata was chairman of the Tata Group. And what had happened to Aspi Engineer? Aspi Engineer had actually gone on to become the Air Vice Marshal of the Indian Air Force. In 1957, Aspi Engineer wrote a letter to JRD Tata to greet him on the 25th anniversary of Tata Airlines. And JRD Tata wrote back to him, saying, of all the letters and messages I have received, none pleased me or brought back more pleasant memories than yours. Do you remember the time we participated in the Aga Khan competition? You were only 17 or 18. And, I took you so seriously as a competitor that I spent at least a day checking everything on the plane. And he goes on to say, our friendship ever since has been much more worthwhile than winning the competition would have been. I enjoyed every moment of that adventure. And then he goes on to say, for me, one of the highlights that remains important is when I landed in Karachi, when I came back from England to Karachi, you received me at Karachi airport with a platoon of scouts and with a medal that you put on my neck to receive me back. That was terribly nice of you. And that was to me one of the highlights, even though I lost the race. So actually, Aspi Engineer had met JRD Tata on arrival to give him this medal. What a graceful relationship that was. When I think about this, JRD Tata gifting his spark plugs to his competitor, then the two of them remaining friends for a lifetime, I often ask myself, is it really important to win every single race in life? We are all very competitive people. We want to win as many races as possible, but is it important to win them at any cost? Or is it far more important and meaningful to help someone, to bring a smile on someone's face, to nurture relationships that stand the test of time and which make our own lives all the more rewarding? And to me, this story of a young JRD Tata brings that to mind. I wanted to narrate this story also today because not many people have heard the story. I can go on and on, ladies and gentlemen, but I think I'm running the end of my time now, and I'd like to leave time for questions and answers. So I just want to, as I've narrated these 5 or 6 stories from Tata Stories, I just want to say, why should you read this book? One is, of course, it has the rich heritage of the Tata Group, which touches all our lives in some way or the other. But more importantly, I think each of these 40 stories have got invaluable life lessons to inspire us, just like the story of the race and the life lesson on creating friendships and even respecting your competitors. These are lessons which I believe can provoke us to do much more with our own lives. I think these are astonishing. They may be stories from the Tata Group, but they're astonishing tales of the human spirit, of purpose, of courage, of resilience, of grit. Actually, many of these stories make us smile, but many of these stories also make us cry. I must tell you, so many readers have written back to me and said, I felt a lump in my throat. I felt emotive. The story filled me with pride. The story told me I can do much more with my own life. I think together they combine to do magic. When I was writing these stories last year, a young lady professional wrote to me and said, these stories move me so much, I've started reading out these stories to my 4-year-old daughter so that she can pick up some of these values, and I read them out as bedtime stories. The reaction to this book has been excellent. Many people encouraged me to write this coffee table book, but after that, many people have written to me with their views on the book and saying I gifted this to my father who has retired from Tata Steel. He's enjoying the book. Someone has told me it's the best book I've ever read this year. Someone else writes that every story provides a lesson in human values, and others say that this book will inspire you, lift your spirits, and provide perspective on many broader issues of work and life. One of these readers, who is a doctor from Cochin, and he has permitted me to use his photograph, actually sent me this picture. And he says, from your book, I read one Tata story every night to my children, and they've been enjoying the stories very much. So for all these reasons, I would encourage you to pick up Tata Stories and read this book. It has recently been declared a national bestseller by Penguin. But of course, as a writer, I would be very gratified if you decide to read this book yourself and also give me your feedback. My email address is within the book, or you can, link up with me on LinkedIn and give me your feedback on what you think about this book overall. So with those few words, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to bring my session to a close.